Hello, my name is Jordy Izzard, and I am an Associate Director of Alumni Relations at SAIS, and today's date is March 18th, 2014. I'm here with Carmen Grayson, who went to Bologna in 1963, left in 1963, came to SAIS and graduated with her MA in Washington, D.C. in 1964. And we're so happy to have you, and we're just going to have a little bit
fun.
Yeah, thanks. A conversation today. And why don't we just start with what originally brought you to SAIS?
Senior at Georgetown in the Foreign Service School, and I wanted to go to Europe, and I wanted somebody to pay my way. So I applied for a Fulbright, and I applied to SAIS. The Fulbright I got was to southern France. It was going to be to study local newspapers and the political impact. Of course, I didn't know what I was talking about or anything like that. But SAIS offered a 2-year scholarship and Italy. And that is why I went to SAIS. I wanted to go to Europe and get a degree at the same time.
That's great.
And Italy, especially northern Italy, was just a dream thing.
That's great.
So there was no career trajectory.
Well, let's talk a little bit about from 1962 to 64. Then you were in Bologna in Washington,
Right.
And tell us a little bit about what it was like to be a student then.
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
What is not to like? Someone's paying your way in one of the most beautiful countries on earth. Georgetown was very, very intense in the Foreign Service School, so I looked on Hopkins as a bit of a relief in a way. Even in Bologna, it was not the most important thing in the world for me to study, which is a shameful thing to admit. But there are other kinds of learning, right? And so that year was the first time, probably since first grade, where academic achievement wasn't a factor, or not the major factor, where it didn't matter to me so much if I didn't get an A+, which of course used to be the driving force at Georgetown, things like that. Socialized women, you're going to do well. That mixed with travel, places I've been. We were in Czechoslovakia on a trip on one of our summer things, and Berlin and all over Europe. That's a pure joy, and you meet a lot of European kids who probably, many of them had more international, obviously, they're from Europe, experience. And that was a pure joy. Everything about it was just wonderful. You didn't have to worry about money. You didn't have to worry about friends. You could study, but that wasn't your driving force at that point. SAIS here was very different because you come back in 64, and I got married soon after I came back to another SAIS student. And in November of the year, came back, Kennedy was assassinated. I was in a SAIS class when we got the announcement. It was Professor Cook. He taught philosophy. I think it was a political philosophy class. And
everybody remembers where they were.
They do. I even remember his reaction was something like, well, something like that'll take care of the right wing. And who knew then about any other connection? So the assassination shaped that last year at SAIS in a way. Something was altered. See, that was November, and then we graduated in the following year, in May. And then what was already on the horizon was the Vietnam War. So that entered subtly into relationships. That was more of a factor, I would think, in the years after me, where not having to go to Vietnam was a major issue. But it was too soon for the anti-war movement to have been a divisive issue then. So that's interesting that you asked that, because I have the real action against the war came in the mid-60s, and that was not when I was in school. But when I went back to school, it was at UVA.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about when you graduated from SAIS in 64.
Well, of course, this is how life works. With an MA in international relations, you know where you're going to end up. I taught French in high school for a year. because...
Where was that?
In Manassas, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And I can still remember it paid $4,000 a year. Of course, I knew nothing about teaching French. But it was an interesting time because Manassas, I don't know, now it's a different world, but then it was a very small southern community, great history. Integration was just starting. Even the buildings were sort of, I taught in a Quonset hut for a while. That took me into, it's hard to describe. It's not going to marches in Atlanta or sit-ins or anything like that. It was facing young people coming out of a very southern background, black and white, and teaching them. Second year they let me teach history, which was a big advance, in world history. But you're still have in front of you young people who don't know much about the world except the tiny one they're in. And that was, I'm not finishing my sentence here, but I remember getting into trouble because I started an international relations club the second year I was at Osborne High School was the name. And a parent complained because I had said something in class about, I taught poli-sci and history and all of that, about the Mandarin class in Asia. And the parent thought there was something about Mandarins that was communist or something. And that was the first time it dawned on me that not everybody comes from an international background too. And I didn't even know how to defend myself. I didn't even know I was actually being attacked. And the IR club went on because there were local people. You know, in Manassas and Fauquier County in Prince William, there are a lot of retired agency people. Mm-hmm. And so you could get people to come and talk. But none of that bothered them, that if you would have an ex-CIA agent didn't bother them. But talking about Mandarin somehow bothered them. Another thing that happened, you're too young to know about Edward Bennett Williams, who was this hotshot lawyer here in Washington, and he wrote a book called One Man's Freedom, which was basically about the Bill of Rights. And I wrote him and said, I teach in a school where it's a public school, but I don't have a lot of money. Could you donate some of your books? And he sent me 2 cardboard boxes with the paperback copy of his book, One Man's Freedom, which worked in a poli-sci class because these kids, you know.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
It was, and I look back and think that meant a lot of things went over my head. For example, the whole thing about the what was that big rock concert in New York?
Woodstock?
Woodstock, yeah. That happened in the outside world when your little world right in front of you is these young people trying to figure things out. And so Edward Bennett Williams, who then went on and did a million other things, to these little groups of students who read that, it was quite good when I look back.
Mm-hmm. And what did you do after Manassas?
Then the war was over.
Yeah, where did that take you?
I taught there for 3 years because my then husband's grandparents lived in Warrenton, Virginia. I don't know if you know where Warrenton is. And his grandmother was very ill, so we moved to the country to help take care of her. And the 3rd year after I taught from 64 to 69, whoa, that's 5 years, isn't it? I wanted a PhD in history. I applied to Hopkins, actually. It was wonderful. There was a history department. There was a professor there named, I think his name was Alfred Chandler, and he was a business historian. And I didn't care what I was going to study. I just wanted a PhD.
Right.
And the reason, I'm going to come across these terrible motivations, the reason was I knew I wanted to have a family, and I knew it would be very hard to have young children on a high school schedule. So, plus you want to study forever, especially history majors. There's something about them that's so interesting. Duh. And so I went, so Hopkins, it was a silly mistake and it didn't matter. It's just because I couldn't drive from Warrenton to Baltimore very easily. UVA, which is where I ended up going, also had a very good graduate history. So I went there. But the letter I got from Johns Hopkins thought I was a man. This used to happen a lot because first name Carmen apparently, obviously, can be both. And said, dear Mr. Grayson, we're very happy to. I thought I should have always gone back to him, and so I almost went back to Hopkins, but got
That's
a PhD
interesting. I would
at
think
UVA.
Carmen would more be a woman.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Man.
did
Although
this
I do
guy
know
know
men.
opera? Or
Yeah.
No, I probably was just a young secretary, didn't... Anyway, I thought that was a... Okay, there's one thing Hopkins has to get straight.
I am female, yes.
Yes. Anyway, so that's that.
And then what happened in the 70s and the 80s?
Let's think. Yes.
Well, in the 70s you were getting your PhD.
Yes, which was wonderful. There again, that's when I first drowned in manuscripts, and how marvelous a life that is. And I had a very good professor from Bucknell, he's a World War II veteran, Bill Harbaugh, my mentor, and he's the papers of a statistician economist who was in the New Deal were an alderman.
Uh-huh.
And I was also pregnant early on there. And so, but while you're pregnant, you can still do all this stuff. And I can remember, though, being very frustrated at one point, and I said to him, well, what do I do now? I mean, there's all this material, it's not really filed very well, or something like that. And I remember he went like this, he said, Carmen, you pick up a piece of paper, you read what's on it, you turn it over, and then you go to the next piece of paper. I thought, he's right, it's just the micro slog through
doing it,
and it was wonderful fun. But so the 70s are the children years, and I taught in '69. I went from Manassas High School, and let me think now, where am I going? I got a job in '69 while I was in grad school, and that was at Hampton University, a very small historically black college in Hampton, Virginia. And it's funny, I remember these prices now, because that salary was $9,000 a year, which when you have young kids, you count it up, of course. And when I retired 25 years later, I was being paid $33,000, which I thought was fantastic. And then I come back in the real world where some of my SAIS classmates are in the 6 digits. I thought, this is another life. I sort of missed that connection, because in academia you never...
Yeah.
Well, some did, I suppose, but you don't go in it to make a lot of money. But it occurred to me later, there are ways, if you wanted to, you can make a lot of money.
Some people write books, too.
Well, yes, but at a small college, as Hampton was then, fortunately, it had a strong curriculum at first. And I think one of the sad things for me over the 25 years there was to watch the curriculum being unthreaded. So some of the classes became racial focus, which I thought was, although my students were primarily blacks until African-American students until the mid-70s, we had an influx of Vietnam vets in the mid-70s, so the classes were black and white. And they were servicemen often, and nurses who were also, how do you put it, these are men who also went into nursing. Hampton had a very good nursing school. So the classes were then men, women, black, white, veterans, undergraduates. Another sort of crucible like Manassas was, where young people are facing each other at a time when categories are shifting. Even their names are going to be different. And I remember one student once, I always asked their names. In the first years you could do that. You memorize, so when they come in the class you know who they are because you've seen their pictures. But a student corrected me once because I'd mispronounced Muhammad. So, and I thought, all right, we're in a new world now. You have to work really... And teaching history is a dream.
Yeah.
Absolute dream. I've never regretted a nanosecond of it. Any difficulties were invariably administrative. That middle level where someone's in charge of your schedule or the window assignment or, God knows what. But walking into a classroom with these young people who want to learn, and talk about getting rid of stereotypes. Some of the best students I had were in ROTC, because I needed a PhD to teach military history. and all my good liberal friends, and that's what how I characterized myself then. Nobody wanted to touch military, and I happily volunteered because I didn't know anything about military history. This was in the early 80s. So in that little group, I got to know the ROTC students who were there because this was a way through college, and they were very serious. It's wonderful. And and some of those students would take my upper level courses, and one of the best ones I had was on history of the Middle Ages. You know, no stereotyping. Once you enter that class, they know you care about them, and you take your job seriously. Colors, gender, blah, blah, blah. Right. You just open the world for them.
That's great.
You see what I mean? So you don't make any money, but oh my God.
Yeah.
My only regrets as I look back are classes I know I didn't teach well. You know, a day when I had not prepared the lecture well enough, or I didn't. And you want to go back to these students and say, I know I didn't do that one. Can we go over that subject again? It's
interesting.
It really was.
And that was 25 years you were there.
Yeah.
And so so that was like around 75?
69 till, oh gosh, I have to go back and look at the paper. It was 69 to 97, something like that.
Oh, okay. So you were there while you were at Virginia, too. Because
Yes.
you were doing your PhD.
Exactly.
Wow,
yeah.
Okay. So then that took you to 97.
There were babies, PhDs, and classes. That's all I remember. And pickups, so you pick up the children.
A lot. And then that brought you to 97.
Yeah.
And then what happened? What's happened since from 97 till now?
Well, I'm unmarried. That took a little time. Oh, don't look so sad. And it was when I retired from Hampton and came back from Williamsburg, came back here. I actually bore down on manuscripts again, and again, the motivation is backwards. I never came in thinking that's where I want to land. I wanted to, because I was still living in Williamsburg, I wanted documents that were at the Library of Congress so I could go back and forth, and fell into this wonderful subject, which was a Civil War general who actually was pretty active here in Washington named Montgomery Meigs. He built the Capitol, the Capitol Dome and all that, and the aqueduct, and the building museum, the old pension building. But, and that took me into American history, which I knew very little about, which is an odd thing to say. But I mean, a period in American history that I knew little about, the Civil War. But he had been in Detroit before then and so forth. And what I discovered in the manuscript room, that a new batch of his family's papers had been deposited and hadn't been looked at. The early batch had been, but not the late batch. And the late batch covered the Civil War itself. And Meigs himself kept, I said Meigs himself, that's true. You've got the formal published documents, but it was his wife and his sister-in-law that wrote, and the mother, who wrote constantly. So a lot of that material is the women writing about the military things going on. The only thing I found out that I published right away, and then I never went back to this, I was going to go back and do all this, but then I had grandchildren, that's another story, was that Meigs was the one in Washington signing off on Lincoln's orders the first year of the war. And the way you find that out is you see the original in the manuscripts, and then you see what shows up in the official records. And the political point of that was that military decisions were being influenced in part by a man, Meigs, who had never been on the battlefield. And that was great stuff.
Wow.
And then getting into the politics of it. The politics, like McClellan, is universally, I mean, there's some subjects you simply cannot talk with anybody about. McClellan Lincoln is one of them. It's very difficult because one is a good guy and one is a bad guy. But I remember reading letters. Someone said, well, McClellan was interested in running for president. Well, of course, the military men, I mean. But I I remember thinking at the time in the 80s when I was going through this, but things have changed and so forth. But I look at the political scene now and you begin to see power working in a different way, and military is a huge part of it.
So is communication
and where you are and what you want and what you're willing to do and who writes the articles in the newspapers and what photographs get published and how you can destroy an opponent, and
strategies are all evolving. Yeah.
Well, those aren't battlefield strategies, you see. You can use a battlefield, like McClellan was within 8 miles of Richmond and they pulled him back, and one of the reasons they pulled him back, and Meigs was in there saying, get him out of there, it failed, we didn't take him on the first rush, and McClellan's ambitious and had some impact. That was what the published article was about. It's a drop in the ocean, it never gets processed until much, much later. What does it mean? But I have a nephew who loves Civil War history, and sort of pulled back from it myself, and he texted, remember we were talking about texting, something about, well, how would you defend McClellan doing this and such? And I love you, Simon, but let's not. So the politics, why should I be surprised that the politics are still a vital factor? You just have to see what you're looking for and being truthful about it.
And now, looking back after you've had a really interesting career and kind of taken it zigs and zags, and what would you say to a current SAIS student today? What advice might you have?
Probably advice that they could follow maybe the second or third time around. You make a hierarchy of what you want. My hierarchy basically was I wanted to teach history and read history, which I still do for the rest of my life. Now, is there a job I can have doing that? Well, yeah, you get a PhD in history and you find a college and you stay there. That is very difficult now. The adjuncts have a terrible problem. They're sort of like hired labor, and they have, women especially often, no guarantee. They don't have that. But when I went in the 69, you could do that. Teach history, adore it, don't make a lot of money, you have job security, so it doesn't matter. That kind of thinking young people can't indulge in now. They have to think of how can I make a living, and is the job relatively secure? So like we were saying before, I would listen to them, how they cope with it, more than I could tell them, other than, the whole point of life is to make it rich and fruitful, and chasing after money is not necessarily the only thing you could do, or being ambassador is not the only thing you can do. You live a really good life, but in terms of advice, they have a harder job establishing a hierarchy than I ever did. Not just me, I talk with my friends, it never crossed our mind we couldn't do exactly what we want and make a living. I may be exaggerating a little bit, but not much.
That's interesting.
And it's nice to feel guilty that the worst thing I did was teach a couple of bad classes, That's I can survive that.
I'm sure they weren't that bad.
No, I just mean like when you look back, it's funny that you remember what you wish you had done better.
Or differently,
Yeah. And that's what I meant. Because when you touch somebody my age, you do reminisce and you do look back. It's like, I think Audrey Hepburn once said, it's like you're walking in a museum. You think, oh, that was me. I could have done that better. But having lived a life where you really reached out to other human beings and made a difference in their little life, like it's quite wonderful.
That's great. Well, thank you for everything you've done, and thanks so much for spending some time with us today. Yeah, and I really appreciate it.